can get into it. We can get into it. Body fluids on the floor, get into it like a hood. We can get into it. We can get into it. Body fluids on the floor, get into it like a hood. What's the motion? Swing a right finger with a left, going straight, take the heart out his chest. Nut buck in the club, homegirls lose the heel saying, my new curls and fuck them bum bitches. They talk like they hands on Mike Tyson. It's kill to be killed when I'm fighting. My sisters not watching, they jumping like double dutch. They like transition cause violence is given. Soft is tripping.
Hey guys, welcome to part 6 of Africa Palestine. I'm super excited to talk to you guys about this episode, and it's quite unique, and I just want to thank you guys for tuning back in. Feel free to hit the subscribe button down below, and if you'd like to, feel free to donate to our Patreon account. If you don't have any money or you don't want to donate, that's perfectly fine. I am not here for that, but our channel is heavily demonetized because of the topics that we cover, but I'm not here for a popularity contest or to be super big on the internet. I'm here to help people and have this archive because we need to help our planet at the end of the day. So I'm just doing my part as an entertainer with my platform to try to share a bit about our world history and however we can improve on these things. So this is going to touch on a bit about the connection between Africa and Palestine and the cause and the reason why West Africans were enslaved. And I touched a bit about that, but I think this will help summarize the entirety from the Islamic point of view of why West Africans were enslaved. And so the interesting thing is when you talk about the transatlantic slave trade, if you speak to a Zionist, they will have this rebuttal just to curve their own involvement with the Roman Catholic Church about their involvement with the transatlantic slave trade with these Dutch Ashkenazi merchants. And these would be people like Aaron Lopez, Jacob Rivera, Isaac Hart, who was like the biggest benefactor in Newport, Rhode Island for the transatlantic slave trade, providing merchant aspects, providing money, and the usury aspects the Catholic Church wasn't allowed to practice. What you'll hear from Zionists to distract away of their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, you'll hear them bring up the Arab slave trade. Now, the truth of the matter is that yes, there was Arab enslavement, but this did not take place until the Ottoman Empire took Constantinople in 1455. And it wasn't a slave trade, it was more enslavement, and this was war related, not ethnic related, which came from the European side, which is a more based around Greek ideology of who has more charisma and their leadership qualities of blonde-haired, blue-eyed. That the ideology that the Roman Church and the Roman Empire in general, before they became a church, but the Roman Empire, that they took that ideology from Greece and they conquered all of Europe with that ideology of superiority. So that pervades throughout the Roman Catholic Church, and that also pervades through with European Ashkenazis. So the Arab slave trade was never ethnic related at all, but it did take place. And so the slave trading and was due to the Ottoman Empire conquering Constantinople, and then the Ottoman Empire, obviously they moved south, and so they were involved in some slave trading in East Africa, in Zanzibar. But like I said, this was more war related to people that may have resisted war. And obviously the Ottomans also moved into Egypt, which is the reason why modern day Egypt right now is way more fair-skinned, and it's not as Nubian or African as it used to be, because when the Ottoman Empire went to Constantinople, they moved downward and they took over most of Arabia, and they moved all throughout North Africa. So you got Algeria, you got Libya, and they have a different skin tone, but that was all a gel of mix from migration from the Ottoman Empire taking over those territories, which Rome had pretty much dominated at a particular point in time. Rome had taken over in the Eastern Byzantine Empire, and on the western side, it was ruled by Nigerian Moors. So this is the fact of the matter, and I just felt this would be a very powerful conversation to touch on. So I just want to demystify the information regarding supposed and Arab slave trade. Now, when you Google this online, if you Google Arab slave trade, what you're going to see is you're going to see a few articles. One that is more prominent at the top, which is from a magazine called JSTOR. I think it's Gestor. It might be Jewish Star. But when you look at who owns JSTOR, when you look up who owns that, it's called Ithaca Hararts, if I'm not mistaken, regarding the name. I'll pop it up right here. But it's owned by a guy named Kevin Guthrie, and he is of Jewish descent. So, and according to them, the Arab slave trade lasted 13 centuries. How is it possible for a slave trade to last 13 centuries? So you're saying the moment in 605 AD, the moment that Islam became a religion, you're saying from that point onward, there was a slave trade? Because that would equal 13 centuries if you move it up to modern day times, which is today. It's not possible, because Nigerian Moors and people that converted to Islam, they were not slaves. They converted at their own will. Sometimes it was war related and war kind of motivated a reason if there was a certain tribe that was resisting or fighting during that time, during some of the caliphates that happened. But there were also people that took on a need to convert just because, and if they were Christian, there was a prediction in Deuteronomy, I think, Deuteronomy 4, of a third prophet coming to earth. And some of them took that prophet to be understood as Muhammad, because Muhammad is mentioned in the Christian Bible. So some people converted to Islam. A lot of them converted to Islam on their own will because it felt like the text in Islam and in the Quran is very simple to read, and it resonated with the people as like a good way to live their life. And so these Nigerian Moors who civilized Europe brought universities there, brought saffron, brought their investments in science and technology, the old information and scribes that were lost when the Roman Empire burned down. It was the Islamic Empire that helped revive all of this old information that had been lost during what they called the Dark Ages, or Europe's, Middle Ages, when they were fighting. A lot of this information was recovered, and it was all recovered and transcribed by Islamic scholars. So it was Islam that taught Europeans how to be civil. And you'll know that because they're all throughout European family crests. And we covered that on our podcast as well too. So feel free to go check that out and dig for that information too. So yeah, so this is going to be a very enlightening conversation. Sit back, enjoy yourselves. And thank you for listening to my preface, and hope you enjoyed this episode. Here we go.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire? What's that about?
So do you remember last year or the year before last year when, well, you don't have a wife, do you?
No.
Okay. So it was a thing that women were doing to their husbands or their boyfriends on TikTok, where my wife, I was literally just at home one day. I don't have TikTok. I have a TikTok account, but I don't use it. And I think I only have one video on there. And I only opened it because somebody else was using my videos and they went viral, and then people were like,
after seeing you navigate my iPad, I believe you.
Yeah, I'm not a technological person at all. So my wife is very big on TikTok. She's always on TikTok. So she came up to me one day and she was like, babe, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? She's from California. And I was like, that was such a random question, threw me off. But I was like, I think about it a lot because the Roman Empire laid the foundations for modern society. If we think about the fact that we're part of a global Western-oriented monoculture, that culture that we have, the Western culture, has its roots and stems in the ancient Roman society. And they controlled the majority of Europe, and they controlled the majority of the Middle East. And most of what we know today as the Muslim world was in fact a part of the Roman Empire. And it's interesting. So, and I speak about this, that's what I speak about in my new book, the fact that for many people, when you think of the Roman Empire, you think of ancient Rome, you think of Western Europe, you think of people in, I don't know, togas and Romulus and Remus, Italians, etc. But the height of the Roman Empire, at the height of the Roman Empire, the empire extended from Western Europe, so Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, etc., all the way into the Middle East, Turkey was a part of the Roman Empire. Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine were all parts of the Roman Empire. Egypt, Tunisia, Libya were all parts of the Roman Empire. And the portion of the Roman Empire that was outside of Western Europe and in what we now know today as the Middle East and Asia was larger and more prosperous than the western part of the Roman Empire. So what happened is during the reign of Emperor Constantine, he splits the empire into two, the western part and the eastern part, and then he moves the capital from Rome to a new city that he builds in between Europe and Asia called Constantinople, which we now know today as Istanbul, which is in the middle of Turkey, in a Muslim country.
What year was that?
Oh, I can't remember the year, but you can Google that, right? But what's interesting about this then is that the capital of the Roman Empire is Turkey, in Istanbul, in what we now know today as a Muslim country. And even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he has a Sahaba called Suhaib al-Rumi, who comes from Syria area, like Sham. But that area was known as Rum to them because it was a part of the Roman Empire. Anytime they spoke about the Romans, they're speaking about people who today would probably describe as Arabs or Middle Eastern people. But that was, in the classical world, considered the Roman Empire and considered the heart of the Roman Empire and the most prosperous part of the Roman Empire. And then gradually the Western Roman Empire fell and became different countries and nations, which grew into what we now know today as the Western nation states that we have now. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued.
Which we now know as the Middle East, basically.
We now know as the Middle East, and they call it the Byzantine Empire. And this is why semantics is so important, because when you call it the Byzantine Empire, you disassociate it from being the continuation of the Roman Empire, and you associate it with something completely different, when really we have to take into consideration that the majority of the Muslim world today, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, Egypt, all these countries that I mentioned, were considered Rome. They were considered part of the Roman Empire, Turkey, Egypt, all of these places. And then not only that, but what's even more interesting is that as Islam rises, all of these territories that were formerly parts of the Eastern Roman Empire or just the Roman Empire are absorbed into the Khilafah. Sayyidina Umar bin al-Khattab, the Caliphate. So Sayyidina Umar bin al-Khattab, the second successor of the Prophet ﷺ, takes Egypt during his time. He takes Sham, he marches into Jerusalem, and he creates a pact with the Christians there and the Jews there so that they can live under Muslim protection and they continue to practice their religions under Islamic authority. The whole region then becomes Arabized, Islamicized, but that is the remnant of the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire continues in Constantinople, so in Turkey, that continued that area, all the way until the 1400s. They are considered as Romans still, and they call themselves Romans. The leader is called the Caesar of Rome in 1400s. And then what happens in the 1400s? 1453, Muhammad al-Fatih, who is the emperor of the Ottoman Empire, or the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, takes over Constantinople. And Constantinople becomes Istanbul, and it becomes a part of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans, and Muhammad al-Fatih being the emperor that takes Constantinople, takes on a new title, Caesari Rome, the Caesar of Rome. And he says this Ottoman Empire is a continuation of the Roman Empire. So if we look at history in that perspective, that means that the Roman Empire began in Rome and continued all the way until the last Ottoman emperor who passed away who was his empire was ended in 1929, making it the longest running empire ever, because the Ottomans considered their empire a continuation of the Roman Empire. And then that also means that the majority of the Roman Empire becomes what we now know today as the Muslim world and the Middle East.
And it's funny you said that, because I was telling you earlier that America is stat padding the Roman Empire, making it like it was a Western European phenomenon.
It began as a Western European phenomenon, but it ends up as a Middle Eastern and a Muslim phenomenon.
Yeah.
The Roman Empire becomes completely absorbed into the Muslim world, and most of the countries today that we consider the heartlands of the Muslim world were once part of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, Stavros, one of my favorite comedians. He's from Baltimore, Maryland, so I love him. He's Greek, and he was talking about when he went and visited Greece for the first time. He was like, man, they're loud, they're hairy, they love olive oil, they are basically Arabs. They have nothing to do with Western Europeans.
Exactly. So I think it's so interesting, and that's why I think semantics and re-evaluation of history is so important. The fact that after the move from Rome to Constantinople, because of the tension between East and the West, that the continuation of the Roman Empire is renamed the Byzantine Empire, it's a ploy to disassociate them from that history, even though that is the continuation of that history, because it's hard to admit that the Roman Empire became Muslim, whereas the Roman Empire became Muslim. And from the 1400s, the people who were called the emperors of Rome were the Ottoman sultans.
Yeah, and that conspiracy I mentioned to you about the Western Roman Empire
becoming the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
I talk about all of this in the new book, Islam and the Making of the Modern World.
Oh man, this is going to be exciting.
Yeah.
You also talk about the House of Wisdom. What's that?
So the House of Wisdom was an organization that was established by Harun al-Rashid, who was the Khalifa in Baghdad. So we see that the nation of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, during the time of his first four successors, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, radiallahu anhum, is called the Rashidin Caliphate in English. And then we see the Umayyad Caliphate begin with Muawiyah. And then after the Umayyad Caliphate rules for a couple hundred years, they are taken over by the Abbasid Caliphate, who claim descent from Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yes. And then one of the most famous Abbasid caliphs, who was the ruler of the Muslim world at the time, was Harun al-Rashid. And what Harun al-Rashid did was he ruled this empire that had absorbed the remnants of the Roman Empire. And so they had the intellectual traditions of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans at their disposal, as well as the new territories that they had towards the east, Persia, and by extension, the Indian subcontinent. All of these areas, the knowledge and their books were available to the Muslims. And so Harun al-Rashid sets up this organization called the House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, when he brings together intellectuals and academics from the Muslim world, the Christian world, the Jewish world, and he says, let's translate all of these books into Arabic so we can start to read them and understand the knowledge of the ancient people. So the ancient Greek works of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates are translated into Arabic. The ancient Roman works are translated into Arabic. And this sparks an intellectual revolution that's known as the Golden Age of Islam. And it's during this time that simultaneously Western Europe is going through the Dark Ages. They don't have access to widespread literacy. They don't have access to the ancient history and traditions and culture. And so it's ironic that Western culture today is based on ancient Greek and ancient Roman philosophy and culture. That's the origin of it. There's a really, really good book that summarizes this called The Passion of the Western Mind. And that book, if you read it, you understand the entire intellectual history of Western culture from beginning in the Greeks to end to secularism and capitalism and all of the isms and schisms that exist today. But you realize that the Westerners had lost touch with the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman culture and civilization, but it was preserved by the Arab Muslims. And so the Westerners, through their interaction with the Eastern Roman Empire, which was bordering the Muslim world, were going to Muslims and studying these things and taking it back to Europe. Not only that, but during that time, the Umayyad Khilafah had extended into Morocco and North Africa. And from Morocco and North Africa, the Moors, which were a movement that started in the Senegal Valley River and went up through Mauritania, the Morabitun, into North Africa, under the Umayyad Khilafah, and then afterwards when the Morabitun and the Muwahhidun came in, they took over Spain and Portugal and they ruled that area for over 700 years. So Muslims in the most prosperous parts of Europe, Spain and Portugal, and then Sicily and southern Italy, as well as the Eastern European areas that were bordering either part of the Roman Empire or bordering the remnants of the Roman Empire that existed there, were all influenced by Islamic culture and society and, intellectual tradition. So the Westerners were seeing the advancement of the Muslims in science, in technology, in all of these areas, and they were going to the Muslims to study and learn and bring that knowledge back. So if you Google, you got the Google here, right?
Yeah.
Google Arabic numerals for me. the way that we write our numbers today, and if we think about the fact that numbers are the foundation of coding, the foundation of all technology and science that we have in the Western world, that the Western world is known for, numbers from 1 to 9 written in this way that we know them today are called Arabic numerals, because they were based on the way the Arabs would write their numbers, and they were taken directly from Arab civilization. Before that, we had Roman numerals, which was the X and the V and the I. You can't code with that. You can't build algorithms with that. Even the word algorithm comes from Arabic. Any word in English that begins with the word alcohol, algorithm, algebra, all come from Arabic words, because they were learning science, mathematics, technology from the Muslims. And this was sparked by the intellectual revolution that was happening in the Muslim world through the House of Wisdom, which is another thing that a lot of Muslims don't know. They don't know that we always, especially us from colonized countries that were colonized by the West, have been given this mentality that Western society is so much more intellectually and technologically superior than everybody else, which is why they're the most dominant culture and prevalent culture, and why people strive to send their children to the best schools in America or in England or anywhere in Europe and make them learn European languages. We're all here speaking English, even though I'm West African and you're an Egyptian Arab, because our parents thought that was better. And you can probably speak English better than Arabic. I can't even speak my dad's language, but I can speak English. No one from my dad's side of the family can speak his language. And my mother's side, I can speak Wolof, but my English is much better than my Wolof, right? Because of the preeminence of Western culture. But Western culture only has this preeminence because of what they took from the Muslims and how they advanced their society from the Muslims. So I talk about that in this book.
And that probably leads to that clash or tension between the two civilizations. Does that lead to your next chapter, the War of the Cross?
The War of the Cross, which is the Crusades.
Okay.
A lot of Muslims don't know about the history of the Crusades. A lot of people in general don't know about the history of the Crusades. The fact that after the Europeans had studied the Muslims, received knowledge from them, received science and technology and advancement from them, they started to resent them. And then with the control that Muslims had over the Holy Land, which was Jerusalem, the Catholic Church started to encourage people to gather together, form armies to go and reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslims. And this is when we start to see the War of the Cross, that the Western Christians were traveling into the Middle East, into the heart of the former Roman Empire, and trying to take back Jerusalem, until they were finally defeated by Salahuddin Ayyubi. There was a time they did take Jerusalem from the Muslims, and that's a time when they took, as well as Jerusalem, they took a lot of the knowledge and the science and technology that was going on in the Muslim world and brought it back to the Western world. And that is what sparked the Renaissance period, which led to Europe coming out of the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment period. That was all inspired by Muslims, because they were in competition with Muslims. And that's also when you start to see Islamophobia and anti-Arab propaganda, Muslim propaganda become prevalent and become a part of Western culture during this time of the Crusades. So a lot of the things that we see today in terms of Islamophobia globally in the West has its roots and its origins in this Crusader period, especially after Salahuddin Ayyubi recaptures Jerusalem from the Christians. And then after that, about 200 years after that, we see Muhammad Fatih capture the heart of the remnant of the Roman Empire. And so now Europe has lost everything. Spain and Portugal belong to the Muslims. The Roman Empire has finally fallen and has been absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Emperor is calling himself the Caesar of Rome. And then all of their former territories, the Holy Land, is also in the hands of the Muslims. And so you start to see then the tension and the Islamophobia really peak in Europe. And that leads to the papal bulls and the beginning of that section of history.
And this next chapter, does it have to do with our popular segments that we've had together, the Blacksmith and the Lion King?
Yeah.
Oh, let's go. That's awesome.
So the Blacksmith and the Lion King, we spoke about that in the last podcast.
Yeah, it's a very popular segment.
It was a very popular segment. The fact that Sunjata Keita, who was known as the Lion King. And my intention wasn't to say that the Disney Lion King had its origins in that story. His name literally just meant the Lion King. That's how I was talking about it. But alhamdulillah, it is what it is. You did research and you found out that the stories were actually connected, right?
Yeah.
Inshallah khair. That's not my
I'm searching us. I want to validate it right now because
that's not really too important to me. But what's important is what I emphasize, the fact that West African society at that time, the artisanal caste was subjugated and the trader caste was raised above them, which led to a slowdown in the production of technology in West Africa, which put them at a disadvantage when colonization started and Europe was more technologically advanced than everybody else, especially when it came to navy and weaponry. And the only reason they were was because they were in competition with the Muslims in the first place. So they were speeding up and trying to develop new technology, new guns, new weapons, so that they could kind of get some form of control over the world. So what's interesting is during this period, and we always speak about, for example, Mansa Musa being the richest man to have ever lived, right? And Mansa Musa was a known Muslim king and emperor. So the image that we have of Africa as a place of poverty, as a place that's subjugated to, colonial powers. And I want you to Google for me the Catalan Atlas. I want to show the people something. Will this appear on the screen in the video? Yeah. Okay. So if you Google this Catalan Atlas, go to images. This was a map that was drawn, in the 1300s. Click any kind of clear image of it. Not this side, the side that deals with Africa. So go back.
I think it was one of the top ones.
Go up. But I want to show
I think it might be this one. Yeah. That one?
Okay, yeah. So zoom out and you see this is an image of Mansa Musa, who is the king of the Mali Empire at that time, or the emperor of the Mali Empire at that time. Richest man to have ever lived, a black West African man from the Mandinka ethnic group. The Europeans in the 1300s are starting to have an understanding of the world, right? And they draw this map, this atlas of the world. So we have this man here, Mansa Musa. He's sitting on a throne. He has a golden crown. He has a golden nugget in his hand. And he has a golden staff to signify his wealth, his authority, and his significance in the region. This man next to him is Abu Bakr bin Omar, who was the leader of the Murabitun movement, who took over Europe. They extended into Spain and Portugal and North Africa. They established the city of Marrakesh. He's also the ancestor he's the father of the first king of the Jollof Empire in Senegal, Jajanjai. Jajanjai's father, Abu Bakr bin Omar, was the leader of the Murabitun movement. Okay, so remember this imagery of Mansa Musa now. Go back out of this and then go to the previous image that you showed of the Catalan Atlas, but let's say, for example, in the rest of Europe. Go scroll right. Look at this king here.
Oh.
Does he seem as wealthy or as rich as Mansa Musa in the imagery?
No.
He's got a little bit of gold, but his crown is not made of gold. Not really significant. Scroll down.
I see upside down.
Oh no, you can't see. Go back and see if you can get a full. This. Go to this one. Yeah. Now, remember how Mansa Musa was depicted. Now zoom in. We see, for example, the Sultan of Delhi. Only one golden crown, no gold in his hands, no gold staff. We see the Christian King Stephen here. One gold crown, but not that much gold around him. We see, scroll down, go up, Kublai Khan, no gold at all. All the major historical figures, Janji Beg, the Mughal Khan, not that much gold either. He's got his little turban. So this shows in Western thought at that time, West Africa and the king of West Africa was the richest monarch of the wealthiest society in the world, in their opinion. But it was a society they didn't have access to because they didn't cross the Sahara to get there. But in their minds, West Africa was not a place of poverty. It wasn't a place that was underdeveloped. It wasn't a place that has all of the negative stereotypes associated with Africa today. In their mind, the way that they were depicting West Africa in comparison to the rest of the world was that it was the wealthiest society with the most gold and the most powerful king. So how does this now affect when the age of exploration begins and they start to want to colonize somewhere? Where do they go? They go to Africa because that's where the gold is. That's where Mansa Musa came from. And that's something that we always have to remember when we think about world history. And also they saw West Africa as a Muslim place, the same way they saw the Middle East as a Muslim place. That the coast of Guinea and West Africa in general belonged to the legacy of these two Muslim kings, Abu Bakr bin Omar, who started the Murabitun movement, which controlled Europe, even the Moors, and the Mandinkas of the Mali Empire, who were both Muslim. And so when they start to colonize, they're going to Muslim areas to colonize, to take power away from the Muslims.
Yeah, get some payback. Huh?
It's more than them just being black or more than them just being African. The transatlantic slave trade becomes racialized over time, but in the beginning, it's anti-Islam. It's not anti-black.
And then they started fearing having the Muslim slaves, as we
exactly, which I talk about in Beyond Bilal.
And then you have the next chapter is Kaiser Rumi, the Muslim
Kaiser Rum, yeah,
the Muslim Emperor of Rome.
The Muslim Emperor of Rome. So, same thing that I spoke about earlier. When we think of the Roman Empire, we're always co-opted into thinking about or imagining the Western Roman Empire, which is where the Roman Empire begins, but it's not the height of the Roman Empire, and it's not where the Roman Empire ends. The Roman Empire begins in Western Europe. Then it transfers to Istanbul in the Middle East, and it becomes a Middle Eastern empire, which is then absorbed into the Ottoman Muslim Caliphate and the Khalifa of the Muslim world, the ruler of Mecca and Medina, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. His title is Kaisari Rum, the Caesar of Rome. And they see themselves as a continuation of the Roman Empire.
If the Romans were so gay and pedophilic, to put it,
the Greeks were, not the Romans.
The Greeks. Oh, okay. It's like, why are we giving them so much credit?
No, the Greeks were, not the Romans.
Okay.
But the greatest empire that ever existed in the face of the world, or the most influential empire that ever existed, and it becomes a Muslim empire.
So you really do see the Roman Empire as the most significant to ever exist?
Definitely.
Even over the Islamic empires?
Definitely. Definitely.
Why do you think Allah bestowed that honor upon them?
I don't know why Allah bestowed that upon them. I can't answer that. But what I can say is that it was absorbed into the Muslim world. And so the Muslim empire is an extension of the Roman Empire, because Islam reaches its height globally after it absorbs the territories of the Roman Empire, such as Egypt, such as Palestine, such as Lebanon, such as Syria, such as Turkey. All of these places were part of the Roman Empire, and they become Muslim. And then the last emperor of Rome is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire.
Do you think that I'm completely segueing here a little bit, because it's just something that's always been on my mind. Does Allah favor people over other people just absolutely throughout all of history?
Allah always speaks about the fact that He favors some people over others.
Right.
But the thing is, we shouldn't look at worldly domination as a sign of Allah's favor. There's a narration, for example, that the 4 greatest kings or most powerful kings to ever exist, 2 of them were Muslim and 2 of them weren't. The 2 that were Muslim were Sulaiman and Dhul-Qarnayn. The 2 that weren't Muslim were Fir'aun and Nebuchadnezzar, I think it was.
Was it Persian?
Or Nimrod.
Persian,
Nimrod
right?
and Fir'aun, yeah. He wasn't Persian, he was Babylonian.
Babylon.
Nimrod and Fir'aun. Fir'aun, as we know, is the worst enemy of Allah, but he's one of the most powerful kings that ever existed. Sulaiman is one of the most favored prophets to Allah, and he was also one of the most powerful kings to have ever existed. So
But
the
let's say-
worldly mulk, like the worldly domination of having wealth, of having power, of having influence, is not a sign of your favor in the sight of Allah. The sign of your favor in the sight of Allah is your taqwa and your iman, and we will only be able to see that in the akhirah. That's why Allah says in the Quran, if we look in the worldly life, some people have been raised above others, and in the akhirah there will be more distinction and more separation between people. But the akhirah is based on your iman and your taqwa. It's not based on your wealth or your power. يوم لا ينفع المال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم.
But why wouldn't someone... Sorry.
The day that your wealth and your children don't benefit you, but whoever comes to Allah with a sound heart, a clean heart.
Why wouldn't, though, a kid in the heart of Central America look at all these great dynasties throughout history and not have a feeling that his people or her people were completely left out of the picture in the story of humanity and God?
I feel like that is the depiction of how history is told. If the child in Central America is never taught about the Aztec Empire or the Mayan Empire and the great civilizations that existed on the American continent before colonization and before things, then they'll always think that they're left out of history. The same way, for example, Africans growing up and black people growing up, when you hear stories of the Roman Empire and you see Netflix series about Alexander the Great, but there's nothing made about Mansa Musa, or there's nothing made about King Menelik, or there's nothing made about the Empire of Zimbabwe or Congo, you're going to think that Africa doesn't have any history or civilization, when in fact the Europeans in the 13th century were depicting African kings as the most powerful and wealthiest kings in the world.
Yeah, and now they're turning them into Lion King movies. That's my last reference for Alhamdulillah. So back to your the book that is most recent out, Black Muslims in the East. We've so far been talking about the book that will come out, inshallah.
Inshallah. Islam and the making of the modern world. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one, man.
I am too.
I feel like what I've written there, I want people to know just as much as I wanted them to know the information that was in Beyond Bilal, if not more. Because it's going to be more relevant to a lot more people.
You know what's so funny about what you're saying is the information, the knowledge in this book, because I actually read them and like really enjoyed them, it has become like a basic knowledge that I have now. And I think it's so normal. And I'm like, wait, I only know this because I read Beyond Bilal. And I wouldn't have known it otherwise, so I can't really judge other Muslims for not. But once you have the information that you speak about in these two books, you feel like you can't operate as a Muslim without having this information.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that segment. And so yeah, now we're going to touch on a little extra bonus part. As you know, in 1884, in Africa, there was called the Berlin Conference, and they ended up breaking up Africa and partitioning off Africa between all these European nations and giving them authority to go into Congo, which Belgium went into, and it's caused the current disaster that is happening in the Congo. It started way back because of the Berlin Conference, and they've had issues with Europe and Africa in its entirety post-slave trade ever since. The transatlantic slave trade started in around 1492, right when the Moors were expelled out of the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. So, but the permission to go into Africa was in 1411, and that was through Papal Gum Devarius, which we covered on our podcast as well. But long story short, after the Berlin Conference of 1884, prior to World War I, after World War I occurred, Europe did the same partitioning of the Middle East that they did to Africa. So there was never any Middle East. So I want to share this information with you just so you know exactly what happened and why the Middle East had been partitioned up. And the reason why there's a great divide in the Middle East currently today is based around there are places where they have princes installed and all throughout the Middle East. And places where they have a prince installed, it means that for the most part, they were installed by Western governments. And these are the countries that tend to be more, less supportive of assisting Palestine. And it's also because they're being blackmailed. So it's sort of against their own will, I would say, because of who has more dominance from the US and Israeli perspective. But, in those areas where they have a royal family in the Middle East, that was never Arabic culture. A lot of these people were installed and put in power. As you know, Saddam Hussein was one of those people that, like, in Iraq, he was put in power by the CIA. And same with the Shah of Iran, he was put in place with the assistance of the CIA. And so the US and other Western governments have always been meddling in the Middle East, but I think it's important for you guys to also be aware of why you may be confused, or why there's also seemingly some Arab nations not supporting Palestine, even if they would want to. And it's because they have an ode that they owe for agreements that they've made with Western governments, that they're sort of blackmailed. And that's what happens if you go against what the West wants. They will do regime change. You see that all throughout Africa. You see that with Sudan. You see these rebel groups that pop up. As you know, Al-Qaeda was formed, ISIS was formed, all with Western influence, you know? So it's good for you guys to be more aware in that subject. So enjoy this little bonus section, and much love to everybody from all the Arab nations around the world. We know we're all trying to make our world more of an equitable place, but also some of these countries also in the Middle East that had some Freemasonic temples that were put there as well too. So there is a Masonic connection of why some of them are capitulating to some of the West's demands, because they're trying to fit into that society and survive, you know? So much shouts to everyone around the world. And yeah, let's keep healing our planet. Much love. Enjoy the video.
The modern Middle East is a region troubled by war, terrorism, weak and failed states, and civil unrest. But how did it get this way? The map of today's Middle East was mostly drawn after the First World War, the war that planted many of the seeds of conflict that still plague Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Syria, and even Iran today. When the First World War began in 1914, the map of the Middle East looked much different than it does today. Most of the region was part of the Ottoman Empire and had been for centuries. Britain controlled Egypt and some strategic points in the Gulf, and a weak Persian state was informally under the influence of Britain in the south and the Russian Empire in the north. After the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire disappeared and a host of new states replaced it. States whose borders were decided in far-off capitals and whose people were caught up in the chaos and uncertainty of an unstable new order influenced by ideas like nationalism, self-determination, and Zionism. For some, the new order held out hope for a better future, but for others, only fear. Even before 1914, the Middle East was a vital strategic region. Germany built the Berlin to Baghdad railway to extend its influence, Russia wanted Constantinople and saw itself as the protector of the Ottoman Empire's Orthodox Christians, France felt the same way about Middle Eastern Catholics, and Britain was concerned about the safety of the Suez Canal route to British India. Ottoman fear of the Russians, British and French is part of the reason the empire joined Germany and the Central Powers when the First World War began. For the next 4 years, fighting raged in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Sinai, and Palestine, alongside widespread famine and the Armenian genocide. As the war dragged on, both the Central Powers and the Allies tried to undermine each other's empires. The Germans and Ottomans appealed to Muslims under French, British, and Russian rule, while the Allies appealed to minority Christians and Arab nationalists living under the Ottomans. The great powers also struck secret deals with each other to divide the spoils of war in case they won. All these deals had one thing in mind: winning the war as soon as possible and benefiting from that victory. The contradictions and conflicts of wartime agreements could be sorted out later, or so they thought. One of these wartime deals was between the British Empire and the powerful Hashemite family of the Hijaz region, part of today's Saudi Arabia, but then part of the Ottoman Empire. The Hashemites were led by the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi, who agreed to lead Arab tribes loyal to him in a revolt against the Ottomans. In exchange, the British promised that the Hashemites would rule a future independent Arab kingdom, but the deal was vague about borders. Hussein hoped that if the British won, his family could lay claim to new territories and power, and the way to legitimize this quest was through Arab nationalism. The Hashemites claimed that they represented the desire of Ottoman Arabs for freedom and their own national state, ideas that some Arab intellectuals and nationalist societies had indeed been calling for, though not necessarily under the Hashemites. This worked for the British, who positioned themselves as liberators. Many noble Arabs have perished in the cause of Arab freedom at the hands of those alien rulers, the Turks, who oppressed them. These noble Arabs shall not have suffered in vain. So from 1916 to 1918, the Hashemites led the Arab revolt against the Ottomans, with British assistance via T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. There is some debate about the military effectiveness of the uprising, but politically, it set high expectations for the peace, expectations that would be disappointed. The British knew their deal with Hussein violated a 1914 agreement with the French and Russians, which stated that any post-war land settlements would involve all the Allies. They also knew that the French had their own interests in the Middle East and might not be too keen on Arab independence. In late 1915, French diplomat François-Georges Picot made France's case clear. France would never consent to offer independence to the Arabs, though at the beginning of the war she might have done so. It was unthinkable that the French people would acquiesce in the placing of Christians of the Lebanon under a Mohammedan ruler. So Picot met with British diplomat Mark Sykes, which resulted in the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916. Once the Ottomans were beaten, each ally would get its own sphere of direct and indirect influence in the Arab provinces and part of Anatolia, the French in the north and west, and the British in the southwest and south. Palestine was to be administered internationally, and earlier agreements gave other areas to Russia and Italy. Any future Arab kingdom would be under French and British influence. But there were doubters, like British Brigadier General George MacDonough. It seems to me that we are rather in the position of the hunters who divided up the skin of the bear before they'd killed it. I therefore think that any discussion at the present time of how we are going to cut up the Turkish Empire is chiefly of academic interest. So the British had promised the Hashemites an Arab kingdom, and the British and French had then divided up the same region between themselves. Palestine was the exception. There, the British made another controversial deal to help their war effort. The Zionist movement had existed since the 19th century and promoted the idea of a Jewish state. Zionist thinkers like Theodor Herzl considered several possible locations, but most settled on Palestine, which was the ancient homeland of the Jews and still home to a Jewish minority. Even before the war, Zionist Jews had been moving to Palestine, which created tensions with the Arab majority. We are a nation threatened with disappearance by the Zionist tide in this Palestinian land, a nation which is threatened in its very being with expulsion from its homeland. In 1917, the Allies were still struggling to win the war, and Russia dropped out after the revolution. At the same time, some in the British government, like David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour, were sympathetic to the Zionist idea, an idea lobbied for by prominent British Zionists like Chaim Weizmann. London hoped that by supporting Zionism, the Jewish diaspora around the world might rally to the British cause. Some British politicians like Lord Curzon and Edwin Montagu, who was Jewish but anti-Zionist, opposed the idea, but in November 1917, Balfour sent a telegram to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This was a dramatic commitment, but a vague one, since it was not clear whether national home meant state, and what the situation of the non-Jewish majority would be in practice. So in order to win the war, the British had made a deal with the Hashemites for Arab independence, the British and French had made a deal to divide most of the Middle East, and the British promised to support Zionism. As if this wasn't complicated enough, in 1917 the United States joined the war, and the tangle of contradictions began to unravel. In January 1918, President Woodrow Wilson unveiled his 14 points for peace. Wilson's points included the concept of self-determination, that each people who identified as a nation ought to determine their own future. This seemed simple in principle, but it didn't match with the reality of mixed populations and mixed identities on the ground. There were Arab nationalists, but most Middle Easterners were still not familiar with the relatively new concept of national identity. They usually identified more with their religion, tribe, extended family, or home region. Yes, some tribes joined the Hashemite revolt, but most did not question Ottoman rule and remained loyal to the existing system, whether they were enthusiastic about it or not. Those who did feel a drive for national self-determination, be they Arabs, Zionists, Kurds, or others, now felt that there would be a state for them after the war. High expectations that would be very hard to meet. After successful British offensives in Palestine and Mesopotamia, the war finally ended with an Allied victory in November 1918, and a strange interlude began. The armistice had stopped the fighting, but it would take time to sort out the post-war order. British and French troops occupied the Ottoman Arab provinces and parts of Anatolia, the Americans brought humanitarian aid to feed the starving, and the politicians discussed the fate of Europe and the Middle East at the Paris Peace Conference. Delegations of nationalists made the trip to Paris to argue their case, though most would return without any concrete promises. Lebanese Christian patriarch Elias Hoaik was an exception when he lobbied the French government to take a clear role in Lebanon. All my efforts will be aimed at obtaining, in accordance with the Lebanese national will, the complete independence of my country with the help of France. The resulting peace treaty signed at Versailles in June 1919 not only formally ended the war between the Allies and Germany, it also created the League of Nations, an international organization to maintain peace. The League would play a key role in the fate of the Middle East, especially since the British, French, and Americans now began to argue over how to implement the wartime agreements. The British felt that since they'd done most of the fighting against the Ottomans, they deserved a bigger share of the spoils. The Americans opposed the secret wartime diplomacy and insisted that the League should oversee the gradual independence of Middle Eastern peoples via so-called mandates. This meant that a developed state would be responsible for advice and assistance until the new states could function on their own, in theory. In practice, it wasn't quite clear how the mandate would work, including to the Hashemite would-be rulers of a new Arab kingdom. What does the word mandate mean? We do not exactly know. I only wish to say that the nations in whose name I speak intend to remain free to choose the power whose advice they will ask. Their right to decide their fate in the future has been recognized in principle. Very well. But a secret agreement to dispose of these nations has been prepared, about which we have not been consulted. I ask the Assembly whether this state of things ought to exist or not. While the heated discussions were going on at the League, the US Congress changed its mind, and even though the League was President Wilson's idea, the US refused to sign the peace treaty or join the League when it officially came into being in January 1920. For the British and French, this was an opportunity. At the San Remo Conference in spring 1920, they formalized the military reality on the ground. France became the mandatory power for Syria and Lebanon, while Britain did the same for Mesopotamia, Transjordan, and Palestine. This allowed them to indirectly rule while not officially taking these regions on as imperial possessions. In the words of historian Michael Provence, the populations of the mandated territories thus assumed all the responsibilities and none of the benefits of national sovereignty. One question the conference did not resolve were the borders. They would have to wait until a peace treaty could be signed with the Ottomans, who still ruled, but in name only. The League did say France and Britain had to consider the wishes of the population, but British and French administrators mostly ignored local petitions. The American King Crane Commission's survey received conflicting results. Some people wanted democracy, some wanted a greater Syria, including Lebanon and Palestine, some wanted British oversight, some French, and some American, and some wanted a Hashemite king. A majority did not want the mandates at all, and 99% were opposed to Zionist settlement in Palestine. After all the wartime deprivations and sufferings, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and a lack of a stable New World Order, it isn't surprising that there was widespread violence in the Middle East after the Great War ended. Egypt rose in a failed revolution against British rule in 1919, and there were clashes between religious and ethnic groups in Lebanon. There was a major war in Anatolia between the Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal and allied, mostly Greek, troops, which resulted in the creation of the Turkish Republic and the formal dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. In Persia, the British wanted to counter Bolshevik Russian influence and secure access to oil, so they supported a coup by future Shah Reza Pahlavi, who took control of the country in 1921. But the violence that was the most intractable and arguably impacted the troubled future of the region most of all occurred in Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. In Palestine, the British Mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration, and British authorities encouraged Jewish settlement. Some 35,000 Jewish settlers arrived between 1919 and 1923, hoping for a better life. International Jewish organizations often helped settlers buy land, some of which, but not all, was previously infertile. Some also declared their desire not just for a Jewish homeland, but a Jewish state, which stoked tensions with Palestinian Arabs, as did the British administration working closely with Zionist groups. Some British officials and Jews wanted to curb settlement, but when enthusiastic Zionist supporter Herbert Samuel became British High Commissioner in Palestine, British support for settlement became more explicit. The British and some Zionists argued that settlement would benefit Arabs through economic improvements, but most Arabs saw things differently. Writer Musa Kazim al-Husseini complained to Colonial Minister Winston Churchill in August 1921. Jewish settlers depreciate the value of land and property and at the same time manipulate a financial crisis. Can Europe then expect the Arabs to live and work with such a neighbor? In response, Churchill reiterated his support for Jewish settlement. Things turned deadly with Arabs rioting in Jerusalem and an organized firefight at Tel Hai in 1920, claiming the lives of a handful on both sides. Tensions fully boiled over in May 1921 in the town of Jaffa. A fight between rival Jewish socialist groups near a mosque spun out of control and led to deadly rioting between Jews and Arabs. Arabs killed 47 Jews, and the next day, Jewish groups and British police retaliated, killing 48 Arabs. A British commission mostly blamed the Arabs, but admitted that their grievances stemmed from, quote, political and economic consequences of settlement and perceived pro-Jewish bias of the British. Zionist Ze'ev Jabotinsky felt that the time had come to build a metaphorical wall around the settlers. Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. French rule in Syria and Lebanon got off to a violent start as well. Hussein's son Faisal had led Arab forces into Syria in 1918 and announced his claim to the throne of a Syrian kingdom. But the French would not give up control, so French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and Faisal agreed that Syria would become a de facto state under the French mandate. Faisal's Arab nationalist allies of the Syrian National Congress, however, wanted full independence and control over Lebanon and Palestine. A nationalist society informed Faisal of their position. "We are ready to declare war on both England and France." Faisal's priority was becoming king, so he reluctantly agreed to cancel the deal with the French and was crowned King of Syria on March 7, 1920. France threatened to invade, so Faisal now accepted their terms, but his answer arrived late, so a French army invaded Syria anyway from its base in Lebanon, and defeated the ragtag Arab army at the Battle of Maysalun in July. Faisal fled to Mesopotamia, but Maysalun became a symbol for Arab nationalism and resistance to European imperialism, as Ali Alawi has written. It was a military disaster, but its name has gone down in Arab history as a synonym for heroism and hopeless courage against huge odds, as well as for treachery and betrayal. Faisal's position between the French and the nationalists and his own family's ambitions have caused lots of historical debate about whether he was a power-hungry opportunist, a sincere pan-Arab nationalist, or both. In Mesopotamia, the British were also struggling. Their military was stretched thin across the region, bureaucrats fought departmental turf wars, and politicians argued about how much independence Mesopotamia would have, and whether it would be 1, 2, or even 3 states in the future. One thing soon became clear: the population was divided. Some of the urban elite were not against British control, while the ex-Ottoman Officers Association and much of the tribal countryside was. In June 1920, a local Arab politician warned British Administrator Gertrude Bell. "You said in your declaration that you would set up a native government drawing its authority from the initiative and free choice of the people concerned. Yet you proceed to draw up a scheme without consulting anyone." That same month, the Iraqi Revolt, also known as the Iraqi Revolution, began. From a local tribe resisting British troops imprisoning one of their own, the unrest spread across the Middle Euphrates region. Tribal forces besieged several British garrisons, captured Najaf and Karbala, and defeated multiple British relief columns. It took the British until November and 450 dead to put down the revolt, and the settlement included a vague promise of an independent Arab kingdom that had yet to be defined. The fighting, though, caused some in Britain to question the mandate. How much longer are valuable lives to be sacrificed in the vain endeavor to impose upon the Arab population an elaborate and expensive administration which they never asked for and do not want? The British defeated the Iraqi tribes, but they didn't understand them. Bureaucrats wrote reports that blamed the revolt on a conspiracy between Turkey and Faisal, a conspiracy between the Germans and the Turks, and possibly the Bolsheviks too, the machinations of the American Standard Oil Company, Pan-Islam, or the Jews. Tribal leader Saeed Muhsin Abu Tabih was more pragmatic. The British hastened the revolt's timing by their ignorance about the proud personality of the Iraqi and the numerous political mistakes that they committed across the country. There is a historical debate about the Iraqi revolt or revolution as well. Some see it as a rebellion of different groups who were upset at British rule because it was foreign and heavy-handed. Others emphasize the role of former Ottoman officers who supported Faisal as future king. Still others consider it a national revolution that laid the foundation for a modern Iraqi identity and eventual independence. The shape of the modern Middle East became more clear by 1921, even though formal peace only came in 1923. At the Cairo conference, the powers agreed that Faisal would rule over the Kingdom of Iraq, his brother Abdullah would become king of Transjordan, and Britain would continue to support the Zionist project in Palestine. Though Britain would still have significant influence, the new kingdoms enjoyed more autonomy than the British had intended, thanks to the Iraqi revolt. Independence, though, would have to wait. The French soon divided Syria and Lebanon into 5 separate states, which they would rule for years to come. They also decided to create Greater Lebanon by attaching several Muslim districts to mostly Christian Mount Lebanon, creating an unfamiliar and volatile mix. And so the First World War had swept away the centuries of Ottoman rule and created a new Middle East. It was a region of fragile new states, supposedly on their way to independence thanks to the League of Nations, but in fact under British and French imperial control. There was violence between religious and ethnic communities, and there was violence against foreign domination. And in Palestine, there was the uncertainty of the Zionist project. Would it result in the creation of a Jewish state, or would it result in perpetual tensions in Palestine? Or perhaps both. The roots of the Middle East conflict were planted after the First World War, but it really escalated during the Cold War, where the superpowers got involved and several wars were fought in the region. In the background, Israel was pursuing the acquisition of nuclear weapons, much like the US and USSR had done during and after World War II.
This is the Middle East about 100 years ago, okay? A little more than 100 years ago. In the beginning of the 20th century, let's say 1900. It looks like that. And this is the Middle East now, after Britain and America. And France came and they started drawing random borders. Okay? That's before, that's after. Because you see all of these countries and this whole concept of, a state, it's a European concept. It's a Western concept. This is not a concept that came from the region, nor was it agreed to by anyone in the region. Syria is all of this. Do you understand? All of that is Syria, but they then splintered it into little pieces. Oh, you've got one thing called Israel, then you got another one called Lebanon, and then you have another one called Palestine, which is like 2 parts. And then you have another thing called Jordan. And then, you know what, let's give a chunk of Syria to Iraq, and then we'll give another chunk of Syria to Turkey over there. And then, we'll just add some other countries down south. Let's go and make up, Kuwait and the UAE and, gas stations, basically. Gas stations, which is what they call Russia. They like to call Russia a gas station. No, actually, the real gas stations are these things. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE. These are gas stations, okay? So these borders are barely 100 years old. I'm talking about Sykes-Picot in 1916, and then we have Balfour Declaration a year later in 1917. All done in secret, all planned not here in the Middle East, but over here in Europe. So you tell me what gives anyone here the right to go down here and start carving things up. You can't. There's no argument for this. So Israel is completely made up. Okay, I mean, Zionism is even worse than what we're talking about, because the carving up, the fracturing, the balkanizing of this region was not only about creating Israel. Like I said, it's about putting rich families in seats like Saudi Arabia. The whole concept of Saudi Arabia is we want a family that we know are bandits, the House of Al Saud, and who are going to be aligned to our interests. Now, keep in mind, 73, king back then, different story. But for the most part, Western aligned. Kuwait, again, it's a piece of Iraq that they then carved out and said, oh, there's a lot of oil here. Kuwait. Oh, welcome to Kuwait. And then the UAE. The UAE is even bigger of a joke, because most people who live here are not even they're not even Arabs. They're not even from the UAE. They're foreigners. I think it's 80%. 80%. I mean, if there was ever a fake country, look no further than Israel. But this is a good example as well. And lo and behold, who were in the Abraham Accords? Oh, it's those gas stations, Bahrain and the UAE. So do you understand the game here? And who is next in line to normalize ties with Israel? Oh, it's our buddies, Saudi Arabia. Oh, and who has already normalized ties with Israel? It's those other countries, Jordan and Egypt. Now, we got in a stranglehold, in a chokehold, that we made sure are going to do what we say. Now, Egypt, of course, is Egypt. Who can say Egypt is not real? Jordan, again, you got Hashemite family who puts in place controlled, it's a Western asset. I mean, the guy's, forget it. I'm not talking about his wife. I'm talking about the king. His wife's Palestinian. I think she has no choice but to stay quiet, even though she tried to object to this. But, she doesn't have any power. If she had power, she'd be gone. So you do understand the game here. And then when it comes to Syria, at the end of World War I, they kicked the Ottomans out. The Arabs did that, okay? And they did it with Britain's help. Now, the whole point was that you had Faisal, Prince Faisal, who then became King Faisal, and he was elected. He was elected to be leader of what is Syria. And they weren't happy with that. So you had something called the Kingdom of Syria, the Arab Kingdom of Syria. And then they basically, the French came, they removed him from power, and then Britain took him next door to Iraq. And they tried to make him popular in Iraq and kind of imposed him on people, even though he wasn't, he had no a base or any kind of support there. It's illegitimate. It's another, propped up leader. Not that he was propped up in Syria. In Syria, he was really legitimately elected. And it was democratic and it was independent. But no, it's because it's democratic, because it's independent, because it's not controlled by France and Britain that it had to go. Do you understand? So Britain, France, and America fucked the whole Middle East, and it's 2024, and these borders, these ridiculous lines on the map that are fake, that are illegitimate, that no one voted for, that no one asked for, they are the source of all the problems that you see today. Every single thing. Genocide in Gaza. Ethnic cleansing in Gaza, in Palestine, in Jerusalem. Whether we're talking about Christians or all Palestinians, it's the same thing. Displacement of populations. You got Palestinians going into Syria, Iraqis coming into Syria, and then Syrians going into Europe, and then you got some of them in Turkey, and you got Armenians that were killed, and it also went to all of these genocides, all of these transfers of populations, ethnic cleansing, were done by Europeans and their allies. So Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Remember, during Armenian genocide, all of the guns that the Ottoman Turks used were manufactured. They were German Kar-98s, K-98 rifles. So, I mean, it's the same thing you're seeing today. Half the bombs, 47% of the weapons Israel is importing are German. Same goddamn thing. Nothing changed. So we are seeing the effects of things that happened 100 years ago, because they're still there. Nothing changed since 100 years ago, right? So what I'm interested in, I'm not interested in these borders. For me, these borders are fake. I just gave you the reason why. They're literally fake. It's not like my opinion that they're fake. They were drawn by a bunch of people in Paris. What the fuck does anyone in Paris have business doing drawing borders in the Middle East? Is it okay? So is it okay for, the president of Syria to just start carving up France? Why not, right? Since we're doing this, why not? I think we should allow that, right? So either we undo this with reparations paid by Britain and France and America, or we can keep going with this trend and we can have the president of Syria, maybe, I don't know, carving up France into like 50 countries. How about that? Right? Every département gets its own phone code and becomes its own independent republic. And why not have Scotland become independent as well? And then inside Scotland, we can have another 50 countries, right? Since we're doing this. How about that? It's only fair. It's only fair. It's only fair. So this is a bunch of rubbish to me. I'm not interested in these borders. It's just like in Africa. I mean, we got 54 countries in Africa. 54, right? How many of those do you think were drawn by Western powers? You can go ahead and guess in the comments, because it's a fair bit. And then, of course, Latin America is a different issue. I'm not going to go through every continent now. I want to stay with the Middle East, with the Levant. So this needs undoing. Once again, we have Syria that's fractured into 5, 6 pieces. And we have the rest of them. Now, not everything in the Gulf is necessarily bad. Like, I mean, Yemen, Oman, for example, they've done nothing wrong, right? But these things here, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, I mean, they're a disaster for the Arab world. They've done nothing but house American bases, right? All of the American bases are in these countries. And they do nothing but attack other Arabs with them. I mean, when they invaded Iraq, they invaded it through Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis, this criminal family that was installed by Britain, gave the Americans permission to put bases and weapons there, right? Now, I know Bin Laden doesn't like that. I don't give a crap about Bin Laden. He's a CIA asset. So we go back to the same thing, right? I'm talking to you from an anti-colonial viewpoint. So I'm not interested in all these lines. These lines mean nothing. They're a joke. Okay? They're a joke. They're a joke. No one voted for this, right? Usually this should be one country. This should all be Syria. Syria used to go all the way to where you see Gaza, ironically, right? So this over here is where Syria stretched to. And I can show you, I'll give you an example. Let me read something to you, okay? This is from Ibn Battuta, who's a great, very famous traveler. One of the most famous travelers and explorers in history, okay? And I'll just read to you what he says here, right? So he says, from there we went on to the town of Gaza, which is the first of the towns of Syria on the borders of Egypt. So Gaza is first of the towns of Syria on the borders of Egypt. So as I was saying, Syria was not this tiny thing here. It stretched all the way down to here, down to Gaza. This used to be one country, one region, one place. It's always been like that. Why do you think everyone speaks the same dialect in this, the Levantine dialect? Why does everyone eat the same food, right? It's obvious. And then you've got this anomaly called Isreal, which is nothing, like zero to do with anyone, just like stuck there, a bunch of Europeans. There's, no one is talking about Jews, because you have Jews already in all of these places already. But they then forced them out and then went and put them here, and it's an American base, right? But we go back to the issue of Syria. It's a country that fractured, and then Lebanon, for example. I mean, Lebanon is a country that it's got all these various groups, and they're just at each other's throats. So that's another symptom of this issue. It's a French colonial country that they carved out so that it would be like the only Arab Christian country. Arab Christians don't have a problem being amongst Muslims. Why you got to take all of them and dump them in one place? Again, you see this sectarian colonialism. It's like Israel. Let's take all of the Jews and put them in one place, all the Christians in one place. We'll have like Shiites here and Sunnis there. It's colonial thinking, right? Colonialism 101 from Paris and London. it's unrealistic. It only creates problems. So Lebanon had a 30 years civil war. I mean, I'm not going to go into Lebanon's history because we'd be here all night, but it shows you the problems it creates. I mean, again, and then Israel, the biggest problem of all. The Palestinians didn't even get to have their own share of this stupid state concept. Where is the state that you keep trying to impose on people? Where is it? They don't even get it. They get oppressed on top of it. And then Iraq. I mean, once again, it's like they want to carve it up into pieces, and then they don't even let these pieces be. They have to go in and start invading them and bombing them and sanctioning them and starving them. So, you know, it's a lot of issues, so many issues. And a lot of these problems would not exist were these borders not drawn up, and were these countries like Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Egypt and Jordan enabling the Israelis and Americans, and Qatar, of course, you know, and forget Turkey. I mean, Turkey is not an Arab country anyway. But you know, I mean, Egypt was very different from how it is today, but it got captured. So they have problems with the water down here coming up through the Nile. They built a bunch of dams. I talked about this in the documentary series I made about how they control Egypt. But you see, this is really the best encapsulation I can give you about the Middle East. I'm not going to go into... There are people who are going to try and lie you into details and start saying, oh, it's about Sunni this and Shia that. No, that's the whole point. It's not about that. It's not about that. It's about foreigners, and when I say foreigners, I mean invaders. I'm not talking about an immigrant family. I'm talking about invaders coming from France, coming from Britain, coming from Ukraine, coming from America. People with weapons who are here to kill and steal. This is a completely different equation. It's about them coming here and imposing their thinking on others, and it's so big. I don't even want to know if you would draw up a reparations bill. I don't even want to know what the end sum would be, because every single cent, if you would actually talk about reparations for Sykes-Picot, you would have to count every single, and you count every single cent that is being lost because of wars, because of sanctions, because of all the problems since 1916 and onwards. You have to, right? When someone comes in and starts dividing up your house and making up rooms and moving in new families into your own bedroom, and I mean, so this is the problem with the Middle East, okay? It's Europeans coming in, making up borders, stealing things, and then installing families who you know call themselves kings or royal families, and then like Saudi Arabia, and then putting bases there so they can attack into the future, right? This is it. Anyone who tells you otherwise is a liar. This is what's wrong with the Middle East. It's not Arabs, it's Europeans, it's Americans, and it's their collaborators. They ruined it.
Well, that wraps up the episode, guys. Thanks once again. Hit the subscribe button. Feel free to, if you want to donate. If not, your boy's still going to keep making these messages because our planet needs it, and we need this information archived, that we've done our best during these very difficult and challenging times on our planet to know that we did the best that we could to try to fix it. So, much love, and more Dudes Brewing on the way, guys. All right. Cheers, guys. Cheers.
Why is the rate of depression in Africa lower than the rates in Europe and America?
The rate of depression in Africa is lower, and that's really an easy one. They're not under the same socio-economic and political pressures as we are. They're under different sets of pressures in economic, political, and social. But one of the things they don't have to respond to or explain to anyone that they're Africans. If I live in Jamaica, I say I'm a Jamaican, but then I've got to somehow figure out a way to let that mean I'm an African too. When I'm in America, we used to call ourselves Negro and colors, and then we decide to start calling ourselves Afro-Americans and then African-Americans as a way of saying, I'm not an American wholly. America is a geopolitical place. I'm an African wholly. That's a racial space. That's a culture space. That's a spiritual space. And so, but on the continent, you don't have to say that because you're in your geopolitical space, you're in your culture space, you're in your racial space. You don't have to explain that to yourself. Here, we've got to explain it to ourselves because there's another culture space here. There's another political space here. There's another racial space here that's not African. So, and we're trying to function within that space with the other space being the dominant factor. And so we're constantly under duress, stress, and pressure to perform in a partnership that one of the partners won't allow to be legitimate. And yet we're fighting constantly for that legitimacy, that human beingness legitimacy in the context of a social order and a social ecology that's being determined not by the two parties, but by one party. And it's putting us under a lot of stress because the other party who's making the determination is then telling us, why aren't you self-determining? While at the same time, he's got the power to make the decisions of the degree of your determinations that can be made. You don't have to do that on the continent. You know, you wake up in the morning, you smell Africa, you hear Africa, you taste Africa, you speak Africa, you go and look at your door and you see Africa. And you have a rhythm with nature that Africa has designed. Over here we have a rhythm with nature that an abusive, oppressive, backwards, ignorant, non-civilized person have designed. And we are forced to try to be human within the context of that. That's very hard to do. And it puts you under a lot of stress every day here, the UK, Germany, France, wherever we find our people.
السلام عليكم، أنا اسمي سارة، نازحين من الشاطئ من مخيم الشاطئ، جينا على الجنوب، وإحنا في خربة العدس واليوم عاملين عدس. الحين راح نروح على المطرح اللي احنا بننام فيه. هاي المخيم اللي احنا نايمين فيه نايلون، الشيء هاي فرشة معنا شنو فرشة. شايفين؟ هاي أنا حاطين أغراضنا بس